Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for showing up for this. I just want to let you know I cannot see your faces, but I can see your names scrolling. So I'll be able to see your comments, even though I can't see your if you raise your hands or anything. Um, so you already know that I'm a historian of colonial and revolutionary America, and a military historian. And what I value about military history is not just that wars are kind of interesting as a chess match, but that they reveal the civic and cultural characteristics of a society. This is because wars are national crises, and as such, they allow outsiders to see and understand the society better. Just like a family crisis allows people to peer into that family and understand its inner workings, because a crisis brings internal dynamics to the surface. And this is why a book on the Peloponnesian War is actually a book about Greek society and politics, and a class on the US Civil War or the Vietnam War is actually a class about American civic life and society. So, and this is what draws so many readers to military history and so many students to military history classes. Because for many people, military history is how they learn to understand different civilizations, including their own civilization. So I'll start today's talk by explaining the central debate that occupies me in my scholarship and my teaching, which is the Americanization debate. Then I'll explain what leads me to take my side of this debate, which is the minority position among historians. And basically, I'll show you that the debate on Americanization is a debate about research methodology, a debate on whether historians should take colonial Americans' eyewitness testimony as credible. The two positions on this issue, on this methodological difference, are presented here by Bernard Bailyn, who was a very famous, very prominent American colonial historian, and Karl Helliner, who was a modern economic historian. I'll return to them later, but I hope you can see their divergence. They both agree that hindsight gives historians more information than contemporaries had about contemporary events. But Helliner points out that hindsight encourages confirmation bias in the historian. So I'll introduce you to the Americanization debate and show you how it hinges on this methodological question of who is more credible, revolutionary historians or revolutionary Americans. And then I'll show you how it works in one particular research project, which is my latest research on the Revolutionary War, which should be published next year. So, Americanization. Most historians believe that life in colonial America gradually reshaped the habits, values, and beliefs of English settlers. According to this view, Americans gradually formed their own cultural traits, their uniquely American cultural traits, as the colonies drifted away from English influence. And this incremental Americanization over generations explains the American impulse to eventually secede from the British Empire. The contrary position is that the settlers were and remained conventional Englishmen. Okay? And this group of historians, including me, argue that the settlers retained their English identity, English patriotism, and English customs and sensibilities. And that the revolution was not a product of the settlers' gradual Americanization, but a product of their conventional English attachment to what they called English liberty. So the Americanization debate is a debate about the origins of this country and the meaning and purpose of the American Revolution. Okay, so was the revolution a product of Americanization or Anglicization? A product of centrifugal forces that made Americans more distant and different from Englishmen, or a product of traditional English habits and sensibilities. But beyond the revolution itself, it's also a debate about what is an American. Is the American a new man, or is the American a conventional Englishman? Okay, so Crevecoeur discussed this in Letters from an American Farmer in the 1780s, quoted here. De Tocqueville discussed it in his own writings on America in the 1830s, and we still discuss it today. Now, the framework of Americanization as the driver of the American Revolution is very powerful. First, because every person on the globe is introduced to colonial America already preloaded with the knowledge that the United States is today a distinctive and idiosyncratic country that has a unique role in the world. So this hindsight already encourages us and encourages our historians to identify colonial to look for colonial antecedents to this distinctive and idiosyncratic path that the United States later took as an independent nation. And then on top of that, it also makes intuitive anthropological sense that the American environment would reshape the culture of English settlers. Because we expect people living in different environments to differ from one another culturally. And we expect to find different cultures in the mountains than the valleys, or in hot versus cold climates. Because certainly environment does shape culture. So the Americanization explanation for American identity and American independence makes a great deal of sense as we look back to the colonial era with hindsight. I myself approached my first book with this narrative as my guiding assumption. It's a book on the colony's military history, and I was going to trace the process by which life in America compelled English settlers to unlearn the English way of war and create for themselves a new American way of war. But the settlers say the settlers themselves say otherwise. The settlers showed, both in word and in deed, that they remained committed to the European way of war. And for good reason too, but that's a side matter. And so that's how I was introduced to the contrary narrative of Anglicization, which tells the story of the American colonies as a story of American towns and America itself, the land, becoming more and more similar to England. So it's a story of culture shaping the environment or reshaping the environment. And as I continued in my research and in my classes, I could see that all fields of colonial history feature this disagreement between historians who see ongoing Americanization and historians who see ongoing Anglicization. You see it in American political history, in women's history, intellectual history, religious history, economic history, goes on. Look, even the history of the most distinctive thing, which is American accents, even there, there's this same debate. Some argue that American regional accents were formed in America because of the steady mixing of Anglos with other ethnicities, so how they operate in the social environment, this new social environment. Whereas others argue that American regional accents are in fact British regional accents that were carried to America and preserved here. Okay, so again, so it's a debate in literally every field of study of colonial America. And the Americanization narrative is particularly strong in military history. And both as an illustration of an emerging American character, because how you fight your martial culture is a very important cultural tag, but also as an explanation for the American victory in the War of Independence. So I was enmeshed in this debate early in my career, in that first book. And since then, the Americanization debate has been the running theme of my career, okay, in my books and books and articles and in my classrooms. And I've noticed that what separates colonial historians into these two camps is their method. And what I mean by this is that historians who tell us that the revolution took place because English settlers had incrementally evolved into Americans, different and distant from their mother country, these historians have a major problem because the settlers themselves said the exact opposite. Okay? The revolutionists did not see their political resistance as upholding uniquely American values that they had acquired by living in America. Okay? They insisted that they were upholding values that they absorbed from their English heritage. Okay? They did not perceive a difference or distance from England in the 17th and 18th centuries. They referred to themselves as English. They took patriotic pride in Britain's accomplishments on the world stage, and they saw themselves as integral components of a transatlantic British civilization. Okay? And they understood their revolution as a British event. Okay? Even as they resisted Parliament's imperial reforms in the 1760s and 70s, they explained their resistance as conventionally English. And in fact, they pointed out that their fears and concerns were mainstream beliefs, not just in the colonies, but also in Britain. So historians who narrate the revolution as a story of change and Americanization have to confront the fact that they are at odds with revolutionary Americans. Okay? They have to explain to readers that they have to explain to the readers why readers should trust the expertise of revolutionary historians rather than the experience of revolutionary Americans who were there as eyewitnesses and participants. Okay? And Bernard Bailyn explains why here. Okay? He explains that you should count on the expertise of the historian because contemporaries back then could not see fully and clearly the events that they were living through. Okay? In fact, he says that what historical research reveals is that people were blind to what was happening around them and to them, okay? Because their field of vision was limited to their own experience. So revolutionary historians have more data about the revolution than revolutionary Americans, which certainly is true, of course. Now, I'll give you some examples alongside the one on Americanization in which you can see this clash between revolutionary historians on the one hand and revolutionary Americans on the other, just to show you how consequential these disagreements between the present and the past can be. So on this first question, revolutionary Americans were convinced that they had won the war on the strength of overwhelming support in each of the 13 colonies. By contrast, in the 20th century, most historians came to believe the opposite, that only 20 to 30% of Americans supported the revolution. So these are opposing narratives, not just about the American military victory, but about the meaning of the revolution itself. Revolutionary historians tell us that, the historians tell us that the Patriots were a small fringe of American society, a radical group that challenged the status quo in order to effect change. By contrast, the Patriots tell us that they are mainstream Americans and even mainstream Englishmen, that they're a broad cross-section of the society standing up not for fringe radical ideas, but for conventional mainstream English ideas. And the rebels also insisted in this respect that they were not promoting change, but resisting change. That it was the imperial government that was changing the status quo, and lawlessly. And on the military front, too, revolutionary historians tell us that this was a surprising victory because it pitted this small patriot minority not only against the might of the British Army, but also against the apathy of most Americans. And this belief about a patriot minority also explains why so many people believe that Americans fought a guerrilla war against Britain, because guerrilla, of course, is the weapon of the weak. But the rebels' eyewitness testimony of a patriot majority presents the American victory as conventional, not miraculous. Okay? Winning with superior numbers is not a surprise. Okay? And it also explains why Americans fought a conventional war, not a guerrilla campaign. And it explains why British generals were so extremely cautious with their manpower during the war. And without getting into it, I can tell you that there's good reason and good evidence to accept the eyewitness testimony of revolutionary Americans about strong majorities for the American cause in every state. But again, that's a separate issue. On a related topic, Americans who lived through the war overwhelmingly credited the militia for the American victory. Not only did militiamen serve alongside the Continental Army in major battles, but they also fought in their localities against loyalist militias, Indian war bands, and British foraging and raiding parties. And the militia was also the key to Patriots' civic control of countless American towns, which then enabled the towns to sustain American forces with provisions and recruits, while denying these valuable resources from the British. Okay? But in the 20th century, American historians transferred the laurels of victory from the militia to the Continental Army. So when historians today consider the Revolutionary War, they focus almost exclusively on the National Army's operations and are generally dismissive of the militias. You can see this in academic histories, popular histories, museum exhibits, documentaries. And it's an important question, which again forces history consumers, again, readers, museum goers, to decide who's more credible. Is it the rebels who were there or the historians recovering the past 250 years after the fact? Then on the Constitution, most histories of the Revolution complete the story of the Revolution in 1787 with the drafting of the Federal Constitution, meaning the second U.S. Constitution. But Americans who launched the revolution did not see the second Constitution as a part of their revolution. When they went to war in 1775, they did not envision and did not want the kind of country described in the Federal Constitution. They clarified multiple times before, during, and after the revolution that they did not want a common government to govern them jointly. They rejected the Albany Plan in 1754, and they rejected parliamentary governance in the 1760s and 70s. They wanted 13 self-governing states, and they articulated this in the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And after the war, they rejected two efforts to change this Constitution First, when they stared down the Newburgh conspiracy, and then when they ignored the Annapolis Convention. So the point is that when the rebels tell us the story of the revolution, it ends in 1783. So it's told as a story about a backward-looking movement to resist change and preserve the old order. But when historians tell us the story of the revolution, it ends in 1787. So it's told as a story about a forward-looking revolution to create a new system of government for a new nation and a new nation state. And without going into detail, you'll find the same tension between historians and colonial Americans on these three issues here in this slide. Many historians trace the roots of American republicanism to over a century before the revolution. But all of this is in the realm of the subconscious. Okay, if we look at actual colonists in colonial America, they were not expressing ideological discomfort with monarchy before the outbreak of the war. On taxes too, revolutionary Americans would be surprised to hear us describing their revolution as a tax revolt. Okay? American historians have conditioned our students, or conditioned us, to see the revolution as a conflict over the growing tax burden imposed on the colonies. Even though the Declaration of Independence itself mentions taxes only once and never complains about the tax burden. And even though what ignited the war, what ignited the revolution was the Tea Act, which was a tax cut. It eliminated the tax on tea. So our historians tell us to look at the tax burden to understand the revolutionary spark, whereas contemporaries tell us otherwise. And last, most historians and textbooks guide students to look to Enlightenment philosophy to understand the political values and concerns of revolutionary Americans. But if you shift your attention from, if you focus on, again, on actual colonists, if you look at the American farmers and sailors and shopkeepers and dock workers and teenagers who fought in that war and to their families at home, it's obvious that they were not reading and discussing Locke and Montesquieu or ancient histories of Greek and Roman republicanism. They read the Bible and they listened to sermons at church. So should we examine Enlightenment thinkers to understand the revolutionary impulse, as historians tell us? Or look to the Bible and Protestant worship as the settlers tell us? Now, going back to Balin, I just need to clarify that what Balin is saying is not that it's not that the problem is the faulty memory of elderly eyewitnesses about the revolution of their youth. So it's not that people cannot recall things properly after the fact, but that people cannot understand things properly in real time. Okay? They cannot understand what is happening around them, what they're doing, and why they're doing it. Okay? They cannot tell how popular a revolutionary movement is, what's happening in the war that they themselves are fighting, or when a revolution starts or starts and ends. Because the outcome of the event is still up in the air, so people cannot see the event fully from all sides, like the historian can. And also because, again, their experience of the event is necessarily anecdotal based on what's around them. So when I look back at my career, I can now see the connecting thread in my books and articles and what led me to take my position in the Americanization debate is that it turns out that I was always uncomfortable with Balin's approach, or with the mindset that Balin advocates. Now, I certainly appreciate that some historians should look at factors and forces that contemporaries were not conscious of. But for me, that's too speculative. Yeah, I feel on much firmer ground examining and analyzing how contemporaries understood their lives and their actions. Okay, so Balin is certainly correct that historians have more information about the past than people who lived in that past, thanks to hindsight and integrated data. But as Helliner explains here in the slide, this wealth of data comes at a price. Having so many data points allows historians to connect all sorts of different trajectories of causation. It's up to the historian to determine which dots to connect and in what pattern. And this is why Helliner says that hindsight makes historians so susceptible to confirmation bias, because they necessarily organize all this data into patterns of causation that conform to their pre-existing understanding of society and of history. When we don't follow the lead of the people in the past, because we have so much more data than them, then we follow our own lead through this maze of data. So of course, when I was younger, I wasn't aware that I was following Helliner and rejecting Balin, but obviously I was. I went into my first book believing in the American way of war, but I followed the guidance of the locals. I followed the guidance of the colonists, and so I ended up on the other side of this debate. And then in my piracy book too, I believed in the storyline about the British state policing oceans and ports and eradicating piracy in the 17 teens. But English communities on both sides of the ocean tell a very different story about piracy. And then the same goes for my revolutionary book on the items that we are discussing today. So again, early in my career, I would have had a hard time explaining had I heard of Balin's position on this and Helliner's, had I been aware of the kind of methodological issue here, I would have had a hard time explaining my choice, explaining why I treat people from the past as credible witnesses about their lives against Balin's guidance. And today I can use Helliner's point about confirmation bias, but in truth, that's not the reason. The reason I think people from the past are credible witnesses about their own lives is that I think people in the present are credible witnesses about their own lives. I am, my neighbors are, my colleagues, my family. So I want to show you, I want to give you an example of how these dueling research methods can produce dueling histories of the same event, which in this case is the American Revolutionary War, the war in the West and the war in the East. So the American Revolution featured campaigns in what we call the East, which is painted in green in this slide. And this region was the more settled and secure and economically productive part of colonial America. Okay. And then there were also campaigns and battles in the West, dozens of them, in the area beyond the Appalachian mountain range, which is painted here in beige. And the way our military histories and political histories and textbooks tell us the story of the Revolutionary War is as a tale of two different wars and even two different revolutions. And it starts with the assumption that Western settlers were distant and isolated and disconnected from the Eastern Seaboard events that we all know as the lead-up events to the revolution. from the Sugar and Stamp Acts to the Boston Massacre and the Gaspee Affair to the coercive acts and the British attempts to confiscate gunpowder in Massachusetts and Virginia. And this pre-assumption about the West's disconnection from the East, therefore, produces a narrative about different and disconnected revolutions in the East and West. And on the military front, the Revolutionary War also, it has two separate storylines. There are histories of the real war in the East, and separate histories about what's called the fighting out West. Okay, so in the real war, the United States had a real, quote unquote, real army in the Continental Army and the state militias, whereas in that other fighting out West, the US had just a bunch of local militias or small expeditionary forces held together with Scotch tape. In the real war, the mighty British Army was an existential threat to the nation, whereas in the West, the enemy was a military irritant. Indian war bands, loyalist militias, and small British detachments. The real war featured all the famous generals we all know, like Washington, the Howe brothers, Benedict Arnold, Nathaniel Greene, Burgoyne, whereas the West was the D League of the war, with commanders whose names most people have never heard. Ask your students about Edward Hand or Joseph Grant or Henry Hamilton. Nobody knows. Okay. And then the Eastern War, the real war in the East, has the structure of a proper war with large-scale campaigns and set-piece battles, whereas the fighting out West was this messy collection of small local raids and skirmishes in the woods. They're all very local and disconnected from one another, and certainly disconnected from the major campaigns in the East. So when you study the war in the West, what you do is you use a series of local studies, because the war in the West doesn't have this grand narrative like the real war back East. And you can see this very clearly when you pick up a military atlas of the war. You'll see plenty of battles from the Eastern theater, but either no maps or one map for the war in the West. And if the atlas has one map, it's of Sullivan's campaign, which was the one Western campaign that involved a large force of Continental troops. Okay. And the same goes for artistic depictions of the war. Okay. If you Google for paintings of the Revolutionary War, you'll find plenty of iconic moments from the real war. Okay. All the images here depict Eastern campaigns and battles. But you'll go through many web pages to find images of the war in the West. Okay, it did not have any iconic scenes, iconic moments. So historians show us two different wars in terms of military operations, but also two different wars in terms of political goals. Now, some historians say explicitly that Westerners joined this fight for wholly local concerns. Okay, land vendettas, and security concerns, and not because of the ideological, constitutional, political, and economic causes that drove Eastern communities into rebellion. But virtually all accounts of the war in the West communicate the same message implicitly. Even if they don't say it, they show it. And they show it because in almost all revolutionary books and documentaries and history classes, we start the story of the revolution in the West with the first shots fired there, without all the preceding events of the 1760s and 70s that explain the outbreak of the war in the East. Okay? So the message we transmit by this presentation is that what motivated Westerners to join the fight for independence was the outbreak of Indian violence in their own locality. Okay? They fought for their own security and their land claims. And it goes with that image we paint of Westerners living local and isolated lives, not knowing and not caring about the big Eastern seaboard issues that we identify as the road to revolution, from no taxation without representation all the way to the coercive acts. So what I want to show you as a finale is that those Western rebels tell us in every way that they can to reject this schizophrenic depiction of the revolution. Okay? Western communities insisted against our historians that both politically and militarily, the two theaters of the revolution, excuse me, they insist that the two theaters of the revolution were connected and even similar, despite the surface differences between the densely settled East and the open Western frontiers. Politically, so again, this is the same event politically and the same event militarily, not two separate revolutions, not two separate wars. Politically, Westerners and Easterners riled themselves up and armed themselves for the same reasons and at the same time. Again, contrary to the image that we absorb. And militarily, again, it was the same factors that determined Patriot military success in the East as in the West. So contemporary accounts of local politics in those Western frontier counties in 1774-75 indicate that they were attentive to the dramatic events back east and anxious about the future. During the turbulent year stretching from the coercive acts to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Western communities formed both Patriot and Loyalist associations to support or oppose the First Continental Congress, and then even more so with the Second Congress. Like Easterners, Western settlers were fuming and alarmed by the coercive acts and by the British attempts to confiscate powder and armaments in Massachusetts and Virginia, and then, of course, by the actual fighting that broke out in the East. So long before Indian attacks were launched against them, Westerners convened committees of public safety, corresponded with other committees, armed themselves, and declared solidarity with the people of Massachusetts using the same ideological rhetoric that we all know from the East regarding sacred English liberties being violated and trampled by Parliament. I'll give you a few examples. In Tryon County, which is the westernmost county in upstate New York, committees of public safety convened in nearly every district of the county. In May 1775, upon hearing the news about the British attempts to confiscate gunpowder in Massachusetts and Virginia, settlers on the western frontier of Augusta County, which is the Pittsburgh area, formed a committee of public safety and a committee of correspondence proclaiming the threat to ancient English liberties. They pledged aid to the people of Massachusetts and resolved to form, arm, and train a militia, and they approved a tax on themselves to purchase powder, lead, flints, and cartridge paper. And they asked other Western communities in Virginia and Pennsylvania to adopt similar measures in the name of God, of everything you hold sacred and valuable, and for the sake of your wives, children, and unborn generations. In Westmoreland County as well, in Western Pennsylvania, settlers held a general meeting to discuss the unfolding crisis following the coercive acts of 74. And they resolved unanimously that Parliament had committed a crime against the people of Massachusetts, but also declared that the liberty of Massachusetts was a matter of concern for all English settlers in America. And you can see here in this slide, I hope you can recognize the same language and the same concerns that we recognize from the more famous declarations and petitions and sermons and pamphlets circulating in the East at the same time. So the patriots of Westmoreland, like their Eastern counterparts, committed to form, arm, and train militia companies to resist British attempt or British troops if any tried to enforce Parliament's latest acts. However, as they lambasted Parliament and prepared for armed conflict with Britain, they also pledged their love and loyalty to their king, George III, just as Eastern patriots did at that same stage of the conflict. They explained, again, as Eastern patriots did at the time, and as the Declaration of Independence would do a year later, they explained that they were not trying to innovate, but merely to restore the old order before Parliament's imperial reforms, before, back when America was happy, one of my favorite quotes here, quotations. And so, because they insisted that they're not here to innovate, but to restore the old order, they therefore vowed, just like the Continental Congress did in the Olive Branch Petition, they vowed to submit to the laws that governed the colonies before 1765, before the Stamp Act, back when America was happy. And they vowed to dissolve their standing committee as soon as Parliament repeals its late obnoxious statutes and recedes from its claim to tax us and make laws for us in every instance. And then in North Carolina, too, Westerners in Mecklenburg County called on settlers to, in the same way, to arm themselves and set up independent government until Parliament rescinds its unjust and arbitrary pretensions with respect to America. So it turns out that Westerners had broad horizons. Even though it took news a few weeks to reach them, they knew what was happening in the East, they cared, and they were as distressed as Easterners about British policies in America. And the same is true in reverse. Just as Westerners cared about preserving the liberties of Eastern legislatures and courts, Easterners cared about securing the Western frontiers and Western land claims. So Westerners look to us like country bumpkins living distant and disconnected lives, completely focused on subsistence and survival. But here we have good evidence that they too had political and ideological convictions regarding English liberty, and that these beliefs matched those of other Americans. Okay. Then, when you turn from politics to the war, here too you can see a cohesion between East and West. Okay. The notion that these were two different wars is hard to sustain. Of course, it's true that all American wars, from the colonial wars to the American Civil War, featured a contrast between East and West. Okay? The Eastern theaters of American wars had larger and heavier forces and commanded by more established commanders. And of course, Indian forces figured more prominently on the frontiers than in the East in American wars. And this is this contrast between densely populated regions and sparsely populated frontiers was a feature of early American warfare because it was a feature of early American life. It still is today. Different demographics, different economics, and different security concerns in both wartime and peace. Nevertheless, the same factors that determined American military success in the East also determined success in the West. Okay, so on the American side, both East and West saw the failure of national and state provisioning systems. And in both East and West, the key to Patriot victory was commanders' ability to sustain their forces in the field with foraging. And then on the British side, of course, the reverse was true. If Patriot control of the towns and local militia sustained American forces with manpower and provisions, it denied these essentials from British forces. The British could not find sufficient loyalist recruits and material support, not in the middle colonies, not in the South, and not in the West. And the effect was, in fact, even more pronounced in the West because Britain's manpower crunch in the East, the scarcity of loyalist recruits in the East, prevented Britain from deploying significant forces in the West. And this forced the British to rely heavily on Indian allies for combat missions there, which not only hurt British operations in the West, but it also galvanized Patriot sentiment in both the West and the East. And so it's not just that the story of the war in the two theaters was the same story, with manpower and provisions being the key to American victory and British defeat. It's also that Britain's manpower crisis in the East shaped and exacerbated its manpower crisis in the West. And that Indian atrocities in the West galvanized American resolve in the East. So this little debate about the Revolutionary War in the West, in the East and West, offers a taste of that troubling methodological question of who is more credible about the revolution. Is it the revolutionary historians who tell us that the war in the West is a forgotten war because it was so disconnected from the real war and the real revolution in the East? Or is it revolutionary Americans who tell us that this was one society, one revolution, and one war? Okay. There's good evidence to support the settlers' understanding of the revolution, and good evidence that historians have confirmation bias when it comes to the West. Okay. However, so that's a worthwhile debate, but the reason this little research project should matter to people is not that it teaches us some little thing about the war in the West that we're not usually told. Okay? It matters because it offers really useful insights on American society and on the revolution. Okay? Like I said at the start, wars are crises that reveal the inner workings of a society. And this war reveals two things. Okay? First, that historians have inherited from the 19th century an unwarranted image of Westerners living lives that were disconnected from the mainstream of American life. Okay? The West was remote, but it was not a different country. Okay? Not commercially, not sociologically and culturally, and not politically and ideologically, and not militarily. And second, this war helps us see the revolution as a British event. Okay? The war shows us that historians have inherited from the 19th century an unwarranted image of Americans drifting away from the mainstream of British culture and identity. Okay? And again, America was remote, but it was not a different country. Not commercially, not sociologically and culturally, and not politically and ideologically. Americans were British, and they rebelled because they were British, not because they had drifted away and evolved in isolation into something different, something new. Alexis de Tocqueville observed that the American is the Englishman left to himself. This is how Americans saw themselves in the 18th century, on the eve of the Revolution. De Tocqueville could still observe this in the 19th century. And the only thing that's preventing us from seeing this today is that revolutionary historians do not trust the eyewitness testimony of revolutionary Americans. Thank you. I saw, I'm scrolling through the questions. I know our time is limited, so I'll just pick up 4 or 5 questions so we can head on. Okay, so a question from John regarding this information about this debate about patriot minority or patriot majority. The question is, if there's evidence for patriot majorities, how could historians miss this data? Okay, so if there's data about patriot majorities, how can our historians give us a narrative about patriot minorities? So that it's actually a famous investigation as to where this came from. There are three factors at play here. One, which is kind of funny, and the other two are serious and real. So the first one is just a comedic misreading of a famous letter written by John Adams in I think the early 19th century, in which he recalls, he explains Americans' position on the French Revolution, in which he says that a third of Americans supported it, a third of Americans opposed it, and a third didn't care. Okay, so basically only a third supported the revolution. The problem is that he was talking about the French Revolution, and American historians at some point mistook it, misread it as a comment on the American Revolution. Okay, so that's one factor that contributed to this explanation, this interpretation. The second is a methodological one, methodological factor, and that is that when American historians study the war and the war effort, like I said, they overwhelmingly, in the modern era, in the late 19th and 20th century, they overwhelmingly study the National Army, the Continental Army. And it is true that Americans did not connect with the National Army, didn't go out of their way to support the Continental Army, and didn't volunteer for it in great numbers. Okay? They volunteered as soldiers and service providers for their local and state militias, not the National Army. So, if you as a historian focus on the National Army as the army of the revolution, you're going to see the American population disinterested or even not supportive of this army. Okay, so if you're focused on the National Army, you'll get a skewed reading of support for the rebellion. Okay, if you equate support for the National Army with support for the rebellion, you're going to get this narrative, when in fact, many Americans who were not supportive of the National Army were very supportive of their state armies, their state militias. And then the third factor is, again, it has to do with historians' narrative. Given that the dominant narrative of the American Revolution is that this was a movement to change the status quo, and given the fact that Americans before the 1760s and 70s gave no signs of being enemies of the status quo, then it makes sense for historians to explain this revolution as the product of a dedicated minority pushing this movement forward. Okay, sorry, the lights just went out. So given the fact that Americans were not enemies of the status quo, and here you have a revolution to change the status quo, then it makes sense to see a dedicated minority, a radical minority at play here. But when we flip it, Okay, when we accept the patriots' own testimony that they were not trying to change the system, but to resist change, then all of a sudden it makes sense that the American cause had broad mainstream support by mainstream people. Okay, a question about the Articles of Confederation. What is this debate? Asking for clarification on this debate between the two constitutions. So when the Articles of Confederation are discussed in the U.S. history textbook, it's not presented as the embodiment of revolutionary ideals. Okay, that this represents the vision of revolutionary Americans. Instead, it's presented as a kind of a setup, as a placeholder and a setup to explain the coming of the federal constitution, of the Federalist movement. Okay, so it's presented and discussed in the textbook and in most documentaries and exhibits on the revolution. It's discussed in order to explain the problems with it and its deficiencies, to thus explain the rise of the Federalist movement. In fact, I remember a colleague of mine from grad school, is after a few years in which both of us were already teaching. We were talking about classes, and he was expressed frustration with students who kept pestering, asking him all sorts of details about the Articles of Confederation. And he was frustrated by how they're focused on this unimportant or less important part of the story and missing the big issues because they were too focused on these details along the way. And it was a nice illustration, which I think I think my friend is representative of a lot of historians, and that you see here that what the revolutionists thought was central to them is completely trivial to the historian who's teaching Americans about the revolution. Okay, so this is a question about this debate between historians and revolutionary Americans about who won the war, the army or the militias, and the question is, what explains this shift in judgment from believing that the militias won the war to the army winning the war? So I think that there are two factors that explain this. First, it's the fact that historians work in national archives, sorry. And if you're sitting in a national archive, you'll be exposed primarily to the national army. Okay, all this national armies leave a lot of evidence, a lot of paperwork. Okay, and when you're working in the archives, you're going to see a lot of evidence about the operations and the problems and the issues relating to the national army. Okay, so historian is exposed primarily to the national army. By contrast, Americans back then were exposed primarily to the militia. Okay? The militia was where the vast majority of Americans did most of their military service, and the militia was the force that was visible in the towns. Okay? So the National Army maybe walked by once or twice during the war. Okay, but the local militia was there all the time, doing all sorts of services and fighting off all sorts of enemies. And doing civic work and doing military work. So that's one factor. That what the historian is exposed to is the national story and the national army, and what the locals were exposed to is local local stories and local armies. Um, but then on top of that, there's also the fact that um, we live in a very different country than the one that they lived in. They lived in a decentralized states' rights republic with very powerful state governments and a relatively weak national government. Okay? And so it makes complete sense that they largely judged the states as the foundation of the American victory, the American victory in the War of Independence. Okay, the states and the state armies, state militias. But once the United States transformed into a centralized nation state, in which state power has receded in the face of federal power, historians have largely determined that it was the national government and its national army that was responsible for the American victory and American independence. I think the historians reflect the kind of country they live in, and revolutionary Americans reflect the kind of country they lived in. Uh, okay, so the question is whether is this tension between historians and contemporaries a feature of historical research or unique to this era, to the revolutionary era? So I would say that the short answer is that it's not unique to the revolution, but the long answer is that it is unique to the revolution. What I mean by this is that this kind of tension between historians and contemporaries is a feature of research, of historical research. Okay, it's just built in, like Balin and Helliner point out. That said, I think it's magnified in the case of the American Revolution because the American Revolution is such a live issue for us today. The revolution, for whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, the revolution plays a central role in debates that Americans are having today about big national issues like gun rights and gay marriage and stuff like that, and taxes, and about small local issues like which books will be taught in your local school. Okay? And you can see this, you can see how big a role the American Revolution, the American founding plays in these debates. When you think just a few years ago, when the New York Times wanted to promote new racial policies in America, new public policy with regard to race, they did this by retelling the story of the American founding with their 1619 project. Okay. Or you can see it, this is one of my favorite illustrations of this process. At the eve of the Civil War in 1861, both the inaugural addresses of Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln featured history lessons about the American Revolution. Okay. Both of them used their inaugural addresses to give a history lesson about the revolution. And then throughout the war, they both continued giving history lessons about the revolution to explain why their side was conforming with the revolutionary vision of the United States. And the most famous of these was famous of these history lessons was the Gettysburg Address. And like I said, we do the same today. Okay, you will routinely hear speakers using the revolution as a launching pad to promote interventionism abroad or isolationism at home or this or that policy in the local school board. And so because the American Revolution is so useful as a political tool in public debate, in public policy debates, the result is that revolutionary history is quite volatile, with historical judgment about the revolution shifting from generation to generation. And these shifts mean that some of these shifts bring historians into conflict with revolutionary Americans in terms of their own account of the revolution. Let me grab one more question. Okay, a question about Crevecoeur. Actually, okay, let me take two questions. So before Crevecoeur, the question here about um, asking to explain the framework of the Anglicization storyline. So I said that the Americanization storyline is built on the observation, the anthropological observation that environment shapes culture. Okay, we know this. So there's no denying that this is true, and no denying that the American environment and the social environment of America, of course, shaped American culture. However, one should keep in mind also that there's also the opposite process of culture shaping the environment. Okay, that's also anthropologically true in every society. So the question is not whether it was did America feature forces of Americanization or Anglicization? Okay? Both were taking place at the same time, all the time. The debate here between these two positions is which forces were more pervasive. Okay? And in the case of colonial America, the evidence indicates that the English Empire featured or facilitated the effective transplantation of English practices and English technologies and English ideas and culture and institutions to America, along with English people and English animals and English plants. Okay, and the result was that over time, colonial America was marked more by forces of Anglicization than forces of Americanization. Okay, so English settlers thrived in America, and not because they were gradually transformed by America to fit this new environment and match it. Rather, they prospered and multiplied in America because they gradually Anglicized America to become less foreign, to become a place that would fit their pre-existing English patterns of settlement and agriculture and manufacturing and trade and social organization, social and civic organization. Okay, so so basically the argument is that America looked more like England in the 1770s than it did in the 1670s. Okay, that as time continued, this land and these towns and these societies and these families looked more like England in English society than becoming more distant and different from them. And this explains why Americans rebelled, not because they had become different American, they rebelled because they were English, and they rebelled for the same reason that English people rebelled in the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and the First Jacobite Rebellion and the Second Jacobite Rebellion. And the last question, I promise. And there are more questions, and I'll be happy to address them by email, but I don't want to keep everyone too long. The question is about Crevecoeur, who I quoted early, and why don't I trust Crevecoeur was a contemporary, and he is talking about Americanization, and so why don't I, if I'm waving the flag of trusting the eyewitnesses, why don't I trust his eyewitness testimony in favor of Americanization? So in my classes, I try to show my students that narratives of Americanization. Actually, let me stop the sharing here. There. Um, so I try to show my students that narratives of Americanization were born with the United States. Okay, that the colonists explained their revolution as Englishmen, but early Republic Americans were already explaining the revolution as Americans with the Americanization narrative. Okay? So I have them read Crèvecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer, which was written in 1782 by a French settler in New York. And in this essay, he explains to European readers that Americans are Europeans who've been transformed by the American environment. And he points out that Americans are even different from one another based on the environment and the weather. Okay, so the northern weather creates a certain kind of American, the southern weather creates, a climate creates another kind of American. There's a similar observation it's kind of a comical one by Adolf Hitler, when he explains why the proper place for Germans to expand to have this living room is Eastern Europe, because the cold climate of Eastern Europe allows the German character to remain intact. And he says that if you transplant a German to Kiev, he will remain a perfect German. But if you transplant him to Miami, you will make a degenerate of him, or in other words, an American. Okay? Because it's again this understanding that the environment shapes the person, and the environment of Eastern Europe is similar to the environment of the climate of Germany, and therefore you can remain German there. But the climate of America is too different, and therefore it'll make Germans degenerate into Americans. Okay. So that's Crèvecoeur's position. And so if you're asking me why I don't accept his eyewitness testimony, I say two things. First, Crèvecoeur's explanation is offered after the revolution. Okay, it's after the American victory. So it's already a recollection. And like I said, it matches what I say about how colonists explained their revolutionary agitation as Englishmen, whereas Americans in the early Republic explained it as Americans with the Americanization narrative. Okay, so Crèvecoeur his narrative is from 1782. It's from the early Republic and matches that. And my point is that it's a recollection. It's not a real-time assessment from the revolutionists as they are rebelling in 1773, 74, 75, 76. One thing. The second, and I think this is the bigger problem, bigger issue with Crèvecoeur's testimony, is that he's not an English settler. Okay? He settled in New York only in the 1760s. So, it's hardly a surprise that Crèvecoeur did not explain the revolutionary impulse as a defense of our English liberties. Okay? He had never absorbed English sensibilities regarding English liberties. Okay, so the point is, beyond the fact that it's a recollection rather than a real-time narration, the real problem with him is that he's not a credible eyewitness simply because he's uniquely unrepresentative of the European settler population, which was 90% British and 80% English. Okay, so those are the two reasons. But I will concede that there are certainly eyewitnesses who spoke the language of Americanization. Okay, you will find them, but they're few and marginal. Whereas the broad statement by colonists in the lead up to the revolution and during the revolution spoke against it, spoke against the Americanization storyline. Okay? Once they won the war, it changes. Okay? In any case, so I thank you again for staying for so long. I appreciate it. And like I said, I will look at the other questions and answer by email to those who have a full name with an email address. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye-bye.